My brother abandoned you. Marry me today, shouted the powerful Duke. And everyone fell silent. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Eleanor Ashford stood at the altar, trembling slightly as she clutched her bouquet. The church was silent except for the sound of the wind howling outside, pushing against the stained glass windows. She could feel the weight of everyone's gaze upon her, and yet there was no comfort in the presence of so many. All she could think about was the empty space beside her, where her fiancé was supposed to stand, but he never showed up. Her heart raced as she glanced down at the empty aisle, and her stomach twisted with the realization that the man she was supposed to marry had abandoned her, left her in front of everyone. Whispers began to ripple through the congregation, growing louder with each passing second. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. The soft murmur of gossip grew into a symphony of judgment, and she could feel her resolve crumbling. Just when she thought the shame would consume her, a deep, commanding voice broke through the noise. My brother abandoned you. Marry me today. Duke William Lancaster, the most powerful and feared man in the room, stood tall at the back of the church, his dark eyes locked onto Eleanor's. The room fell silent. Eleanor's breath hitched in her throat as she met his gaze, searching for any sign of jest, but all she saw was a look of determination in his eyes. Duke William, the cold and distant man she had heard about but never truly known, was offering her something she could never have expected: salvation. He moved toward her with long strides, his presence overwhelming, and his every step seemed to command attention from the entire room. The whispers stopped, and all eyes turned to him. The Duke was not a man to be ignored. He was the embodiment of power, a man who had built his legacy on strength and fear, and now he was offering his protection to the woman who had been humiliated beyond belief. His words hung in the air like a challenge to the very fabric of society. Marry me, he repeated, his voice carrying through the church, and the gravity of his words seemed to settle in the room. Eleanor stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. Could this really be happening? Was this some kind of twisted game, or was it genuine? She could barely believe her ears, but the sincerity in his eyes left no room for doubt. He wasn't offering her a marriage out of duty or obligation. He was offering her a chance to reclaim her dignity, her place in this world, in front of everyone who had just witnessed her public disgrace. As Eleanor's thoughts swirled in a storm of confusion and disbelief, she realized that the room had fallen completely silent, all eyes on her, waiting for her response. What could she do? She had no choice but to answer. She could feel the weight of every gaze on her, but it wasn't the judgment she feared anymore. It was the possibility that this moment, this unexpected offer, could change everything. Could a marriage to a man like William Lancaster really save her from the humiliation she had just experienced? She looked into his eyes, and for the first time in a long while, she saw something that wasn't cold indifference. Something flickered there, a promise, a protection, and perhaps even a chance at something more. Yes, she whispered, her voice trembling with uncertainty but filled with a newfound strength. I will marry you. The Duke's lips curved into a small but knowing smile, as though he had expected nothing less. And just like that, Eleanor Ashford's world shifted. The room erupted into whispers once again, but this time, the whispers were not of scandal. They were of curiosity, of awe. The powerful Duke of Lancaster had chosen her, a woman who had been abandoned and humiliated, and now, she would stand by his side, not as a woman broken, but as one who had been redeemed by the most unexpected of saviors. As Eleanor stood in the church, the weight of her decision began to settle upon her. The powerful Duke of Lancaster had just offered her a way out of the humiliation that had been thrust upon her. She had accepted his offer, but now, in the silence that followed, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would this be the salvation she so desperately needed, or would she find herself bound in another life of duty and expectation? The murmurs of the crowd slowly faded as the Duke took her hand, leading her from the altar and out of the church. His grip was firm, his touch commanding, and despite her uncertainty, Eleanor could feel something shift within her. The tension that had gripped her heart was slowly starting to ease. But there was still the looming question: what did this marriage mean for her, and what did it mean for him? Duke William Lancaster, with all his power and influence, had just publicly declared his intentions. He had made her his responsibility, but what else did he expect from her? They had barely spoken a word since the fateful moment in the church, and now, in the dim light of the carriage, they sat in an uneasy silence. As the carriage rolled through the streets, the Duke finally broke the silence, his voice low and deliberate. "I trust you understand the circumstances, Eleanor. You were abandoned, but I will not let you suffer for it. I am offering you a chance to reclaim your dignity. But know this: this is not a union built on affection. It is built on necessity." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat as she met his gaze, the depth of his words sinking in. He was not offering her love, but something far more pragmatic: protection, stability, a chance at redemption. She nodded, unable to find the words to express her gratitude or her fear. "I understand, Your Grace," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. William looked at her, his eyes softening just slightly, though his expression remained guarded. "Good," he said, "because this will not be easy. You will have to adjust to a new life, Eleanor. One that will require your full compliance, your full loyalty. But I promise you, you will never be left wanting. You will have the respect and security you deserve." The words rang in her ears, both reassuring and terrifying at once. She had been thrust into a life of uncertainty, and now, as the Duke's wife, she would be expected to live up to the expectations that came with her new title. But as she sat next to him, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than mere obligation. There was something in the way he spoke to her, something in the way his eyes lingered for just a moment too long, that suggested there might be more to their union than duty alone. But before she could dwell on this further, the carriage came to a stop outside a grand estate. The gates opened, and they were ushered into a sprawling mansion, its stone facade looming like a fortress against the darkening sky. Eleanor couldn't help but feel small in this vast, intimidating place, but at the same time, there was a sense of safety here. She was no longer alone, no longer the abandoned woman she had been hours ago. She was now the Duchess of Lancaster, and with that came a new set of responsibilities, expectations, and perhaps, just perhaps, the chance for something more. As the Duke led her through the grand entrance, Eleanor was struck by the opulence that surrounded her. The high ceilings, the grand staircase, the elegant furnishings, all of it spoke of power, wealth, and a life far removed from the one she had known. But even in the midst of all this luxury, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still a stranger in a foreign land. This was not her home. This was the Duke's world, and she was now a part of it, whether she was ready or not. The housekeeper, an elderly woman with a sharp eye and a quiet demeanor, led her to a suite of rooms that would serve as her new quarters. As she entered the room, Eleanor was struck by its beauty: soft, muted colors, a large four-poster bed, and a window that looked out over the vast grounds. She ran her fingers along the velvet curtains, the weight of the fabric grounding her in the reality of her new life. As she turned to face the housekeeper, the woman gave her a small, knowing smile. "The Duke is a man of many layers, my lady. He does not give his trust easily, but when he does, it is unwavering. You are in his care now. Remember that, and you will find your place here." Eleanor nodded, unsure of what to make of the woman's words, but something about them resonated with her. She was in the Duke's care, yes, but what did that really mean? Was it just a matter of protection, or was there something deeper at play here? She had no answers, but for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Eleanor had a glimmer of hope. She was no longer the forgotten woman left at the altar. She was now the Duchess, and with that came the chance for a new beginning. But as the night settled in, she couldn't help but wonder what the future would hold. Would this marriage bring her the salvation she sought, or would it only bind her further to the world of duty and obligation? Only time would tell. As Eleanor settled into her new life at Greycourt Hall, the weight of her decision began to settle upon her with each passing day. The Duke had kept his word. She was no longer the woman abandoned at the altar, but now the Duchess of Lancaster. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, Eleanor found herself caught in the quiet web of expectations that surrounded her new life. The grand halls of Greycourt were cold and vast, the silence only broken by the creak of the manor's wooden floors or the whisper of the servants as they moved through the corridors. Eleanor spent her days in her room or walking the garden paths, trying to make sense of her new place in the world. The Duke, however, remained an enigma. He was a man of few words, his eyes always distant, his presence commanding but not warm. They had exchanged pleasantries upon her arrival, but aside from that, there had been no conversation of any real substance. She was still very much a stranger to him, just as he was to her. The housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, had been kind enough, offering Eleanor quiet guidance as she navigated the intricacies of her new life, but even Mrs. Winters was cautious around the Duke. "He is a man of duty, my lady," Mrs. Winters had said one evening while preparing her bath, "and duty is what drives him, not sentiment. You must understand that. He has buried much of his heart, and I fear it is lost to him." Eleanor had no doubt that the Duke had suffered deeply in the past, but what did that mean for her? She had been brought here to marry him, not for love, but for stability and duty. But with each passing day, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was beginning to change between them. The Duke's attention toward her, though brief, seemed to linger more often than it had in the past. His gaze was still guarded, but she could sense that something had shifted. It was as though he was beginning to see her, truly see her, for the first time. One evening, as Eleanor walked alone through the garden, she felt the familiar weight of someone's gaze upon her. Turning, she saw the Duke standing at the edge of the terrace, his dark eyes following her every move. She had grown accustomed to his silent presence, but there was something different this time. She felt an undeniable pull toward him, as if the distance between them had closed just slightly. Without a word, the Duke stepped forward, his footsteps slow but deliberate. "You walk alone a great deal, Eleanor," he said, his voice softer than usual, though still carrying the weight of authority. "Does the solitude help you think?" Eleanor was taken aback. It was the first time he had spoken to her like this, as if he truly cared about her well-being. "I find peace in the quiet," she replied, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "But perhaps it is the silence that speaks the most." The Duke nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. "It is a quiet that I know all too well," he said, his voice almost a whisper, as if he was speaking more to himself than to her. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and Eleanor felt the weight of unspoken words pass between them. The silence that had defined their relationship seemed to stretch on indefinitely, yet in that moment, it felt more intimate than any conversation could have been. The Duke turned away, as though breaking the spell, and Eleanor was left standing there, heart pounding in her chest. What did it mean? What was he trying to say? Was it possible that, beneath the layers of duty and formality, there was something more? She didn't know, but as she returned to her room that night, the questions weighed heavily on her mind. The Duke had shown her a side of himself she hadn't expected, vulnerable, even if just for a moment. It was a side she had not seen before, one that made her wonder if perhaps there was more to their marriage than mere obligation. Days passed, and the tension between them began to shift. The Duke's presence, once cold and distant, became a constant in her life. He began to seek her out, not just in passing, but in moments of quiet conversation. They would sit together in the drawing room, each lost in their own thoughts, but there was an undeniable sense of connection that had not been there before. He still remained a man of few words, but when he spoke, his voice was less distant, less guarded. Eleanor found herself drawn to him in a way she hadn't anticipated. The formalities of their marriage were still in place, but the space between them seemed to be closing, inch by inch. And yet, as the days turned into weeks, Eleanor could not help but wonder if this was merely the beginning. Was there something more beneath the surface of their connection, or was she simply imagining a bond that had not yet formed? She had no answers, but what she did know was that her life had changed in ways she could never have imagined. The Duke, once a stranger, was slowly becoming a presence in her life, and for the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt the stirrings of something deeper, something that might one day grow into something more. But only time would tell if their bond would truly flourish or if it would remain a quiet connection, defined by duty and obligation, and nothing more. As days turned into weeks, Eleanor continued to adjust to her new life as the Duchess of Lancaster. The vast halls of Greycourt Hall, though cold and uninviting at first, had slowly started to feel like home. The Duke, despite his silent and distant nature, had begun to offer her more than just the duties of a wife. She had not expected to find solace in the stillness of the manor, but there were moments when the quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable. She began to realize that in the silence, they shared something deeper, something neither of them had yet named. It was on a particularly cold evening, with the winter winds howling against the windows, that Eleanor found herself sitting in the drawing room, staring into the fire as it flickered and crackled. The Duke had not been home all day, attending to matters of the estate, and she had spent the afternoon alone with her thoughts. For the first time, she allowed herself to reflect on the choices she had made and the life she now led. Her marriage, though born of necessity, had taken on a new shape. The Duke's coldness had slowly turned into something else, something that, while still distant, was no longer entirely devoid of emotion. She had begun to wonder if this marriage could grow into something more, something that had the potential for affection, for care, even for love. Her musings were interrupted when the door to the drawing room opened, and the Duke entered, his presence filling the space as it always did. He looked tired, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his responsibilities, but his gaze softened when he saw her. "Eleanor," he said, his voice deeper than usual, as if it carried the weight of his thoughts. "I trust your day has been peaceful?" Eleanor nodded, though she felt a flutter in her chest at the attention he was giving her. She had grown accustomed to the formality of their interactions, but there was something in his tone that suggested he was asking more than just the typical pleasantries. "It has been," she replied, her voice steady. "And yours?" The Duke took a step closer, his gaze not leaving hers. "Busy," he said, "but I find it comforting, in a way, to come back here and know that you are safe." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had never expected him to express such vulnerability, and for a moment, she felt a crack in the walls he had so carefully built around himself. She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded, the words caught in her throat. They stood there for a moment, the air between them thick with unspoken thoughts, before the Duke broke the silence. "Would you care to join me for dinner?" he asked, his voice softer now. "It is a quiet evening, and I find I would rather not eat alone." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat at the invitation. She had been so used to the isolation that came with her role as his wife. But now, for the first time, she felt a flicker of something more, something akin to hope. She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "I would like that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The Duke led her to the dining room, where the meal had already been prepared. The servants had long since left, leaving them alone in the grand hall. As they sat at the long, candlelit table, Eleanor couldn't help but notice the way the Duke looked at her now, as though he were seeing her for the first time. It was a gaze filled with something deeper than mere duty, something that she couldn't quite place. "Eleanor," he said after a moment of silence, his voice low, "you've been here for weeks now, and I realize that I have not asked. How do you find your new life here?" His question caught her off guard. She had not expected him to be so concerned with her feelings, especially after the way their marriage had begun. But she saw in his eyes that he truly wanted to know. She thought for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "It is different from what I expected," she said slowly. "At first, it felt like a prison, but now, I find moments of peace. Moments when I feel that perhaps, in time, this could be more than just an arrangement." The Duke's gaze softened, and he leaned back in his chair, as if considering her words carefully. "I understand," he said quietly. "This marriage was never meant to be easy, but I had hoped that, in time, we could find something more in it. Something that wasn't born out of obligation." Eleanor's heart swelled at his words. She had never imagined the Duke could say such things, and yet, here they were, speaking honestly for the first time. As the evening wore on, they continued to talk, the silence between them gradually fading away. The more they spoke, the more Eleanor realized that there was something there, a connection that neither of them had expected, but one that had the potential to grow. That night, as Eleanor lay in her bed, her thoughts were filled with the Duke's words. Could this be the beginning of something more than just a marriage of convenience? Could they, together, find a way to make this work, To make it something that went beyond the cold walls of duty? Only time would tell, but for the first time, Eleanor felt a spark of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a future for them both, a future that was theirs to shape. As the weeks continued to pass, Eleanor began to notice subtle changes in her life at Greycourt Hall. The cold distance between her and the Duke, once so palpable, had softened into something more complex, something she was beginning to understand. Their conversations, though still brief, had become more frequent, and each exchange left her feeling something she had not expected: connection. The Duke, though still a man of few words, had started to include her in his life more than before. He would ask her opinion on matters of the estate, and while she remained mostly in the background, her thoughts were heard, considered, and respected. It was a small thing, but it was a beginning. Eleanor had never imagined that this marriage, which had started out as a lifeline from humiliation, could evolve into something more meaningful. They were still not in love, of course. That would take time, she knew. But she began to see the Duke in a new light. He wasn't just the distant, cold man who had offered her salvation out of duty. He was a man with his own pains, his own scars, and she could see, now more than ever, that he was a man who was slowly learning to trust again. One evening, as they sat in the library, the Duke spoke to her in a way that felt different from their usual exchanges. His voice, though still quiet, held an undercurrent of something more intimate, more genuine. "Eleanor," he said, his eyes fixed on the book in front of him, but his mind clearly elsewhere. "Do you ever wonder what could have been, had we met under different circumstances?" Eleanor's heart skipped a beat at the question. It was a question she had asked herself many times since their marriage, but to hear him ask it aloud was something else entirely. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze for the first time in weeks. There was something in his eyes, something vulnerable, something almost hopeful. "I wonder," she said softly, "but I do not regret where I am now." The Duke's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, and for a moment, Eleanor saw the man he had once been, before the weight of the world had worn him down. "Nor do I," he replied quietly. The silence that followed was comfortable, not awkward as it had been in the beginning. For the first time, Eleanor felt a sense of peace in his presence. Over the next few days, they found themselves spending more time together. Whether it was sharing quiet meals in the grand dining hall or walking the estate grounds, the spaces between them were no longer filled with tension. Instead, there was a sense of camaraderie, of mutual understanding. The Duke was no longer a stranger to her, and she was beginning to believe that perhaps, in time, he would not just be her husband, but her partner. But as much as she had come to appreciate these moments of connection, there were still times when the weight of their situation pressed heavily on her heart. She was still bound to him by duty, not by love. And she knew that, no matter how close they grew, there would always be a distance between them, an invisible wall they could never quite tear down. One afternoon, as Eleanor wandered through the gardens, her thoughts were interrupted by the appearance of the Duke. He had come to join her, though she hadn't expected it. His presence was not unwelcome, but it was still a surprise. "The gardens look different now," he said, his voice soft, but there was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't just talking about the flowers. "You've done well with them." Eleanor smiled, though it was tinged with a hint of sadness. "They are beautiful," she said, "but they are still growing. Like everything else here." The Duke studied her for a moment, his gaze searching. "I did not expect you to change so much," he said quietly. "When we first met, I thought you would be like the others, cold, distant, full of reservations. But you found a way to make this place your own." Eleanor's heart swelled at his words, and for the first time, she felt a sense of pride in what she had done. This estate, this life she had been given, had not been her choice, but she had made it hers. She had found peace in the quiet, solace in the gardens, and perhaps, just perhaps, she had begun to see a future for herself here. "I am still learning," she replied softly, "but I believe that in time, we can make this work." The Duke's gaze softened, and he took a step closer to her. "I do not expect you to love me," he said, his voice low, "but I do expect you to trust me. I will do my best to earn it." Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat at his words. She had not expected such vulnerability from him, but in that moment, she saw him for who he truly was. Not just the Duke of Lancaster, but a man who had been broken and was slowly piecing himself back together. And she, too, was starting to heal. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I trust you," she said. The words simple, but they held a weight she had never fully realized before. As the Duke stood before her, his eyes searching hers, Eleanor felt a shift between them. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A new understanding, a new connection, had been forged in the quiet moments they had shared. And though their journey was far from over, Eleanor felt a flicker of hope that perhaps, one day, this marriage, built on duty, could grow into something more. Something real. As the weeks passed, Eleanor began to settle into her role as the Duchess of Lancaster with an increasing sense of comfort. The days no longer felt like an endless, silent stretch of obligation, but instead, there were moments of calm, of peace, and even small glimmers of happiness. The Duke, though still a man of few words, had started to show her a side of himself that he had kept hidden for so long. It was subtle at first, a slight softening in his voice when he addressed her, a genuine look in his eyes that wasn't masked by his usual stoic expression. Eleanor noticed these changes, and though they were small, they filled her with a quiet hope. The mornings, which had once been filled with the awkwardness of strangers living under the same roof, were now marked by a sense of routine. She would join the Duke for breakfast, their conversations more comfortable now, though still formal. He would ask about the estate, about the staff, and occasionally, he would share brief glimpses of his thoughts, moments of vulnerability that he had never shown before. But it was during the evenings, as the sun set and the shadows grew longer, that Eleanor began to feel the shift most acutely. The Duke would often find her in the drawing room, where she would be reading or simply lost in thought, and they would sit together in companionable silence. He no longer seemed like a stranger to her. There was an unspoken understanding between them, one that had grown stronger with each passing day. One evening, after a particularly long day of managing the estate, the Duke came to her with an unusual request. "Eleanor," he said, his tone hesitant, something rare in him. "There is a charity ball in the city next week. I believe it would be a good opportunity for us to attend together." The idea caught Eleanor off guard. A ball. She had not expected to be involved in such social events so soon after their marriage. "I understand if you prefer not to attend," the Duke continued, his voice steady but with a slight edge of uncertainty. "But I thought it might be a chance for us to present a united front, to show the world that we are more than just a marriage of convenience." Eleanor's heart raced at his words. It was a simple request, but it carried a weight she hadn't anticipated. This was not just about attending an event. This was about them, about their relationship being seen by others, about stepping out from the shadows of their shared past and into the light of their future together. She paused, considering his words. The Duke had never asked her for anything like this before, and the idea of standing by his side in front of society, of being seen as a true part of his life, both terrified and exhilarated her. "I would like that," she said, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "I will attend the ball with you." The Duke's gaze softened, a brief flicker of something akin to relief crossing his features. "I am glad," he said quietly. Over the next few days, Eleanor prepared for the event with a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. She had always dreamed of attending a ball, but never in this capacity. She would not be a guest at a lavish affair, but the Duchess of Lancaster, standing beside the Duke, her husband. The night of the ball arrived, and Eleanor found herself standing before the mirror in her bedroom, dressed in a gown of deep emerald green, the color bringing out the brightness of her eyes. Her hair was carefully styled, her makeup subtle but elegant. She hardly recognized the woman who looked back at her. This was a new version of herself, one who had been forged by the challenges and changes of her new life. When she descended the grand staircase, the Duke was already waiting at the bottom, his back straight, his eyes scanning the room as if he were assessing the situation. But when he saw her, his gaze softened, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something more than just duty in his eyes. "You look stunning," he said quietly, his voice low and sincere. Eleanor felt a blush rise to her cheeks at his compliment. She had grown accustomed to his formality, but this was different. This was personal. "Thank you," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The Duke extended his arm to her, a gesture that seemed both formal and intimate at the same time. She took it, and together, they made their way to the carriage that would take them to the ball. As they arrived at the venue, the grandeur of the event took Eleanor's breath away. The ballroom was filled with people, all dressed in fine clothing, laughter and music filling the air. The Duke's presence was immediately felt as he entered, the room falling into a hushed silence as all eyes turned to him. Eleanor stood at his side, feeling the weight of their shared position, but also the warmth of his hand on her arm. They were not just a couple for show, she realized in that moment. They were partners, bound by more than just duty, but by a growing connection that neither of them had fully understood before. As the night wore on, Eleanor found herself dancing beside the Duke, moving gracefully across the floor, her hand in his. The crowd around them faded into the background as she focused on the man before her. For the first time since their marriage, she truly felt as though she belonged at his side, not as an obligation, but as his equal. The night ended with the two of them standing together on the balcony, overlooking the city. The air was cool, but the warmth of the evening lingered between them. The Duke turned to her, his expression softer than usual, his eyes meeting hers with a sincerity that took her breath away. "Thank you for this," he said quietly. "For being here with me." Eleanor smiled, her heart full. "I'm glad I could be here with you," she replied, her voice steady but filled with emotion. In that moment, she realized that what had started as a marriage of necessity had transformed into something far more meaningful, something that had the potential to grow even deeper. She had not only found a place beside him in the world, but a place in his heart, and perhaps, for the first time, she could say that she had found a home, not just in Greycourt Hall, but with him. The days following the ball were filled with a new sense of anticipation and quiet hope. Eleanor had never imagined that the Duke, the man she had once viewed as a distant stranger, could evoke such emotions within her. Their interactions had become more frequent, and she no longer felt like an outsider in her own home. The walls that had once separated them had begun to crumble, slowly but surely, and with each passing day, Eleanor found herself learning more about the man she had married. The Duke, though still reserved and private, had shown a side of himself that was unexpected. He would join her for meals, and the silences between them no longer felt uncomfortable. Instead, they were filled with a sense of shared understanding. She had come to see him as more than just the man who had saved her from a life of disgrace. He was a man who had known loss, who carried the weight of his past with him, and yet, despite all of that, he had found it within himself to reach out to her. Eleanor had begun to wonder if there could be more between them, something deeper, something beyond duty and obligation. But just as she began to think that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for something more, a new challenge arose. One afternoon, as she wandered through the estate, her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the Duke's voice calling her name. She turned to find him standing at the edge of the garden, his expression serious, his brow furrowed in a way she had not seen before. "Eleanor," he said, his tone low, "there is something I must speak with you about." Her heart skipped a beat, unsure of what was coming. She had grown accustomed to his quiet manner, but this was different. There was an urgency in his voice that she had not heard before. "What is it, William?" she asked, her voice steady despite the flutter of anxiety rising in her chest. The Duke glanced around, ensuring they were alone, before stepping closer to her. "There are rumors," he began, his eyes darkening. "Rumors that could threaten everything we've worked for." Eleanor's brow furrowed in confusion. "What rumors?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Duke took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving hers. "It is being said that our marriage was never real," he explained. "That it was nothing more than a political arrangement, a way to solidify alliances." Eleanor's heart sank at his words. She had known that their marriage had been arranged out of necessity, but to hear such rumors, to think that others might see their bond as nothing more than a facade, stung more than she had expected. "But it isn't true," she said quickly, her voice rising with the need to defend what she had come to feel for him. "Our marriage is real, William. It means something to me." The Duke's expression softened, but the concern in his eyes remained. "I know that, Eleanor," he said quietly, "but others do not, and their opinions could destroy everything we've built." The weight of his words hit Eleanor like a blow. She had never imagined that their quiet, growing connection could be so easily shattered by the rumors of others. But in that moment, she realized just how fragile their world had become. The Duke continued, his voice laced with a rare vulnerability. I need you to understand, Eleanor. This is not just about us. It's about the legacy of my family, the future of this estate. If the rumors spread, it could cost us everything. Eleanor stood in stunned silence, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of the situation. How could they fight something so insidious, something that threatened to undo all that they had worked for? And yet, as she looked at the Duke, she saw something in his eyes, a determination, a resolve, that reminded her of the man who had offered her a chance at a new life. She took a step toward him, her resolve hardening. What do you need me to do? She asked, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her heart. The Duke's gaze softened, and for a moment, she saw the man beneath the layers of duty and power. I need you to stand by me, he said quietly. We cannot let them tear us apart. We must show them that our marriage is not just an arrangement, but something real, something that cannot be shaken by rumors. Eleanor nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and determination. She had come to care for this man, and no matter what rumors may swirl around them, she would not allow anyone to take that away. I will stand by you, William, she said firmly, for as long as it takes. The Duke reached out, taking her hand in his. For the first time in their marriage, their hands felt like they belonged together, like they were a team, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Thank you, Eleanor, he whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. You have no idea how much this means to me. They stood there for a moment, the weight of the world pressing down on them. But in that moment, they were united. Whatever rumors may come, whatever obstacles they would face them together. And as Eleanor looked up at the Duke, she realized that their marriage, once born out of necessity, had become something more, a partnership, a bond that could not be broken. It was a bond that had been forged in the quiet moments between them, in the shared understanding and respect that had grown over time. And now, as they faced the future together, Eleanor knew that no matter what came their way, they would find a way to overcome it. Together. The weeks that followed the conversation with the Duke were filled with a mixture of uncertainty and determination. Eleanor had agreed to stand by him, to show the world that their marriage was real, not just an arrangement. The rumors that had spread about their union began to grow, whispers in the hallways, the subtle glances exchanged between the staff, and the quiet gossip among the people in the village. Despite their efforts to present themselves as a united front, the tension remained palpable, and Eleanor could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. She could sense it in the way the Duke spoke to her, his words measured and cautious, as though he was constantly guarding himself against the growing pressure around them. Yet, there was also a subtle change in his demeanor. He no longer seemed as distant as he had before, and the more time they spent together, the more she saw the man beneath the stoic exterior. He would seek her out, not just for matters of the estate, but for companionship, for conversation, and even, on rare occasions, for moments of quiet togetherness. One evening, after a particularly taxing day, the Duke asked her to join him for a walk in the garden. The air was cool, the sky overcast, and the scent of damp earth lingered in the air as they walked side by side. Neither of them spoke for a long time, content in the comfortable silence between them. But eventually, the Duke broke the quiet. Eleanor, he said, his voice low and thoughtful. Do you ever wish things were different? That we could go back to the way things were before all of this started? His question caught her off guard, and for a moment, she struggled to find the right words. She had never imagined that the Duke, a man who had always seemed so composed and in control, could have doubts about their situation. I do, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I wish it were different sometimes, but I do not regret what has happened. I have come to care for you, William, in a way I never thought I would. The Duke turned to her, his gaze intense, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, vulnerability. I never expected to care for you either, he admitted, his voice low and strained. But in the quiet moments, when we are alone, I find that I do. I care for you more than I ever thought possible. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat at his words. For so long, she had seen the Duke as a man of duty, someone who would never allow himself to feel for her, someone who was bound by responsibility rather than affection. But now, in this quiet moment, she realized that he, too, had been touched by their marriage in ways neither of them had expected. They had both been broken by the past, but together, they were beginning to heal. The Duke reached out, his hand brushing against hers, and in that simple touch, Eleanor felt the weight of their unspoken connection. She had never imagined that their marriage could evolve into something like this, something more than duty, but now, in the garden under the fading light of the evening, she felt it. Something real, something genuine. "I will always be here for you, William," she said, her voice steady, but filled with emotion. "And I will stand by your side, no matter what the world may say." The Duke stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression softening as he looked into her eyes. "You have already proven that, Eleanor," he said quietly. "And I will stand by you as well, for as long as it takes. Together, we will face whatever comes our way." In that moment, Eleanor knew that their bond was no longer just a marriage of convenience. It was something more, something that had been forged in the fires of their shared struggles, their quiet moments of understanding, and their growing affection for one another. They had both been shaped by their pasts, but now, together, they were building something new. As they stood there in the garden, their hands still lightly touching, Eleanor realized that no matter what the future held, she was no longer just a wife to a powerful duke. She was his partner, his equal, and together, they would face whatever challenges came their way. The rumors, the whispers, the doubts, they no longer mattered. What mattered now was the trust they had in each other, the quiet strength they had found together, and the promise they had made to stand by one another, no matter what. And in that moment, Eleanor knew that their love, though still in its infancy, would grow stronger with each passing day. The bond they had created was not just a duty. It was a partnership built on trust, understanding, and the promise of a future together. As the months passed, Greycourt Hall seemed to come alive in a way it never had before. The quiet, the cold distance that had once defined the manor was replaced with a sense of warmth and partnership. Eleanor and the Duke had found their rhythm, a quiet understanding blossoming between them. The rumors that had once threatened to destroy them seemed to have faded into the background, no longer carrying the weight they once did. The estate was thriving under their combined efforts, and in the eyes of the people, their marriage was no longer a mere formality, but a true partnership built on trust, respect, and even affection. Eleanor had come to realize that she had found something she never thought possible: love. Not the passionate, all-consuming kind of love she had once imagined, but a love that had been nurtured slowly, steadily, and deeply, like the steady growth of the gardens she had tended with such care. The Duke, too, had changed. He was still a man of duty, still the Duke of Lancaster, but the walls he had once built around himself had crumbled, piece by piece, until all that remained was a man who had learned to trust again, to open his heart to the possibility of love. He had shown her sides of himself that he had kept hidden for so long, vulnerabilities, fears, and desires he had never shared with anyone. They were no longer just a husband and wife bound by duty. They were partners, allies, and in their own quiet way, they had come to care for each other deeply. One evening, as Eleanor stood on the balcony overlooking the vast grounds of Greycourt Hall, the Duke joined her, his presence a comforting weight at her side. The sun had just set, casting a golden glow over the landscape, and for a moment, there was a silence between them, a peacefulness that spoke of shared contentment. "Eleanor," the Duke said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of something important, "there is something I need to say to you." Eleanor turned to him, her heart skipping a beat. She had learned over the months to listen carefully when he spoke like this, when his voice held the weight of something more. "What is it, William?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with anticipation. The Duke looked at her, his gaze softening, his expression more open than it had ever been. "You have changed everything for me," he said, his voice low but filled with sincerity. "When we first married, I never imagined that I would find what I have with you. You have made me see that there is more to life than duty, that love, in its quiet, steadfast way, can change everything." Eleanor's heart swelled at his words. She had never imagined that their marriage could evolve into something so beautiful, so unexpected. She had come to this life with nothing but uncertainty, and now, standing beside the man who had once seemed so distant, she realized that she had found something far more than she had ever dreamed of. "I never imagined this either," Eleanor replied softly, her voice filled with emotion. "But I have come to care for you in ways I never thought possible, William. You have given me more than I ever expected, and I will always be grateful for that." The Duke reached out, taking her hand in his touch warm and steady. "And I will always stand by you, Eleanor," he said, his voice firm with conviction. "No matter what the future holds, no matter what challenges we face, I will always be by your side." Eleanor smiled, the words filling her with a sense of peace she had never known. For the first time, she realized that their bond was not just a duty, but a deep, unshakable connection. They had built something together, something that could withstand whatever came their way. And as the days turned into months, and the months into years, Eleanor and the Duke faced their future together, not as strangers, not as two people bound by obligation, but as partners, united by trust, love, and the quiet understanding they had cultivated over time. The estate flourished, and so did their relationship. The quiet moments, the shared glances, the unspoken words, they had all become a part of the fabric of their life together, a life that had once been defined by duty, but was now defined by something far more meaningful. It was a life that had been shaped by their shared struggles, their growth, and their love for one another. In the end, Eleanor realized that love was not always a grand gesture, but the steady, unwavering support of someone who had come to understand her, to cherish her, and to stand by her side through all the challenges life had to offer. And with the Duke, she had found that love, a love that was as strong and enduring as the estate they had built together. It was a love that had begun with uncertainty, but had blossomed into something more beautiful than either of them could have imagined.